Hey there, John.
So, hi Glenn, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. I'm doing really good. It's summertime, and nothing can go wrong in the summer, you know.
Except if you have to get up at the crack of dawn to be on a TV show because your book is coming out today.
Your book. I noticed how you put that right at the top of our agenda for discussion. Just by coincidence.
Yeah, it comes out today, this Thursday.
This is, no doubt, all about the beat.
That's right. That's my hip-hop book.
Okay, so tell us all about the beat in, shall we say, 90 seconds?
I will. All About the Beat is based on a worry that I have that a lot of very smart people are listening to hip-hop, including the conscious or positive kind of hip-hop, and thinking that the kind of politics that you hear in those lyrics are the kind of politics that help people. And I don't think that they are.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just didn't hear that part about including some of the people who listen to those lyrics, including...
I was listening to these lyrics, including the conscious or positive kind of hip-hop.
Okay, and they think that's a good thing for, I don't know what, the community?
Yeah, they think it's constructive. And I don't think it is, and I began to realize that that is not something that a lot of people understand when I've said it in briefer venues. So I devoted a short book to explaining why I think that the music itself is fine. I like it. It's fantastic music. But that I think that some people take it a little too seriously.
Well, is this any different, John? I have to ask you, and I confess, well, you sent me a copy of this book, and I'm very grateful to have it. I haven't yet had a chance to read it. But I want to ask you, is this different from imputing to celebrities of any stripe, in virtue of their being on TV and everybody knowing their names and their faces, some kind of wisdom, authority, you know, why should we care what presidential candidate they're for and which causes they want to support? Is there anything other than the conventional American love affair with celebrity that's going on here?
I think there's something more specific than that, because the kind of politics that we're talking about is not just a matter of whether you're going to espouse one candidate or another. I think generally it's pretty predictable what candidate, for example, right now most rappers would be interested in, and it's not McCain. But it's just a general paradigm where the idea seems to be that revolutionary politics, or the kind of politics that are waiting for the world to turn upside down, are the ones that the responsible and thinking person has. And I understand why people might think that way, but I look at what's going on in actual black communities and helping people, and I see the overlap between what a lot of even the more intelligent rappers are talking about and what actually helps people seems to be too slight.
Slight overlap.
My comfort. Yeah.
What actually works on the ground and all of this romantic rhetoric don't much intersect. Am I reading you right?
That's the problem. Yeah, and you know something? I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
Long ago I read an article about you, and I remember one image that I carried away from it. And tell me if I'm wrong, because memory distorts. And I'm imagining you jogging down the street, listening to rap in what may have even been a Walkman this far back. And it was saying you were listening to rap. What rap were you listening to?
Okay.
You were finding something positive in the messages.
True confession time, but I mind you, I'm going to answer your question.
Okay.
But I want you and everybody else to know that my listening to this had nothing to do with politics, okay?
Okay.
I was listening for the beat. I was just trying to keep the good old body, which is older than it used to be and heavier than it needs to be, moving on down the road, if you know what I mean.
Right.
So I used to listen to some Michael Jackson and stuff like that, but that's not what you're talking about.
No.
I like these LA guys. I mean, I like Tupac Shakur, the late, the great. I liked Dr. Dre. I like Snoop Dogg, nasty as he could want to be. And, I mean, there were others, but there was nothing unconventional about my taste. I was looking for something that had a real nice beat to it, which would just keep me, on my treadmill or keep me moving on down the road.
That makes sense, and memory distorts. I seem to remember you saying in this article that you were hearing something important, that you were learning something, that it was furthering your views about what the black community needed. But
okay.
I read it a long time ago. Do you remember saying that?
I have no recollection. But no, honestly, in all honesty, I do remember in an article that profile that Adam Schatz did of me that was in the New York Times Sunday magazine. That may be what you're referring to.
Right, yeah.
And, I don't remember saying I thought I was hearing something important, but what I might have, what I might have meant by that was just that, for a guy who's in his sixth, soon to be entering his seventh decade of life.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm glad to be alive. The kind of, modalities of popular culture become increasingly mysterious. Mm-hmm. What it is that moves the young people, what they're listening to, what they're doing. I mean, I kind of say with my own children, this is quite, beyond hip-hop and rap. This is, just generally what the under 25, under 20-year-old set are doing becomes less and less accessible to one.
Yeah,
so I think I probably
right.
meant something like, I'm beginning to see what all the fuss is about.
Okay.
In other words, rap, when, it first sort of came along and started getting popular, may have sounded to me a little bit the way, I don't know, rock and roll sounded to some of my elders in the 1950s and 19, like it was just a lot of noise and they didn't get it.
Yeah.
Maybe what I meant, I hope what I meant, was an aesthetic and not a political point. The aesthetic point meaning that I was learning a little bit of something about where this sort of vector in modern culture comes from, why everybody's listening to what all the fuss is about. I don't think I meant I was learning something about, how the lives of black people will be made better, or how the imperfect democracy with which we are struggling to perfect, could be made more.
I've always wondered what you meant. And this makes perfect sense, but that image of you jogging and listening to a rapper making prescriptions and taking him seriously always stuck with me. I thought, what was he listening to?
I think that's a little inconsistent with my character. I certainly hope so. I mean, I try to be, I'm not always right, but I at least try to be serious.
And I also thought maybe there's some rap that I don't know about, so there's always just stuff. So I just wanted to ask you that question. But, All About the Beat happens to be out today. And
here's one thing I'd say about that. I'm sorry, I do want to get back to your book. Is that I would say... okay, so here may be, and we had some correspondence, you and I think, about this. Remember our letters about 8 Mile?
Yes, I do. That repulsive film.
Right.
Yeah, I remember venting about it.
Yeah, you hated the movie, and I thought it was about something important, and I was kind of intrigued by it. And the thing was
my blood pressure is going up already.
Yeah, sorry?
8 years later. Yeah. 6
I
years
see, you
later.
still hate it.
Still angry. Go ahead.
The thing was, I thought I was going to learn something about how life looked from inside the box. Mm-hmm. That some of these people, I'm going to say some of these guys, because find themselves. What the character of their nihilism and their sort of self-destructive kind of behavioral dynamic. Right. Might be why they might be quite as angry as they are, or how that anger shapes how they're looking at the world, something like that. I thought I might have been learning in some of this, and if not in the artists themselves, then in the reaction of some quarters of their market to their artistic products. Mm-hmm. Might have been learning something about how life looks from that side of the track, something like that.
Yeah, and the way I saw it was, for example, in that scene late in the film where Eminem basically vanquishes Anthony Mackie by revealing that the character had a 2-parent home and lived in the suburbs and/or went to a nice school.
Way too middle class, huh?
Right, and that means that he's not authentic as a rapper. What that symbolized, the whole notion that to be a compelling rapper, you are supposed to be somebody who is downtrodden, and that therefore it's a little suspicious if you're too much like Carlton on Fresh Prince. That to me,
I agree with you, John.
Counterintuitive. And then there was also the fact, and I remember mentioning this in our emails about this. I forgot about this. I remember I told you that I had to go to a bar after the movie to fortify myself before I walked home.
Yeah, I remember that.
So annoyed. I remember the bar. And I didn't like how the only one of the characters who seemed to be able to be a friendly rapper, like when the characters start sort of showing what they can do and how the material they want to use to become rappers, the friendly one has to be the heavy one. And so the heavy one's going to be friendly because maybe there is less of an immediate sense of overt sexuality and toughness because of the shape of his body. But then the other ones have to be grimacing and throwing their hands around. That movie really frustrated me. I also didn't like the cinematography, but that's a different issue.
Yeah, and I was reading that text, viewing that text with a different idea in mind. I was interested in the working class character of this guy in industrial Detroit, and his mother who was a welfare dependent, and his determination to to get his life on some kind of positive track, and how tough that was, and that was the story that I saw in there.
I liked how he was working. That was one nice thing, that he was trying to make his way in his job, and they showed that it's not always easy, and then it got a little better at the end. That was one part that I liked. But
let's not redo 8 Mile. But I want to know about. So you're saying the notion that that rappers are somehow leaders, that their music has any politically relevant content of a positive kind is false. That the things that are working on the ground in these communities are as far away from the rhetoric of these rappers as it could possibly be, and therefore this kind of romantic celebration of this music is opening up a window on some sort of deep liberation insight is
well, almost. One thing I want to change, though, is that I wouldn't say that there's nothing of any political value. There are all sorts of positive statements that people make. But the fact is that what seems to really motivate people to think that there's something about hip-hop that makes it... Some people refer to hip-hop as she. There's the idea that it's a ship that's moving ahead, that it's something larger than music, that even it's a religion, as some rappers are known as putting it, is the idea that there's this revolutionary aspect. So, okay, there's rap that says, be nice to your lady, but there's plenty of music that says that there has been since the dawn of humankind. It's this revolutionary part. And the reason that it worries me so much is because we're at a funny juncture, and it ties in with Barack Obama, because we could have a moment where Barack Obama could help to point us in a constructive direction, because some of the things that he appears to know. But then there's this countervailing idea that comes from a lot of this music, that you're supposed to think that whites sicked AIDS on black people, that you're supposed to think that there's a war on black men, and that's why crack is penalized more heavily than powder cocaine. And that stuff is in everybody's ears all the time, and I wish that would not be taken as the more interesting way of looking at things, so we can get down to the real stuff.
Okay, so I have two things I want to ask you about that. One is, Barack Obama take us in a new direction? Who's the us, and what's the direction? The other is, I've heard hip-hop sung in Arabic. I've heard it sung in Hindi. I've heard... and I don't know what they're saying in the Arabic and the Hindi, but they really look like they might have some political content to what they're saying. What about the idea that, once you let something like this loose in the world, people pick it up and do with it what they will? I mean, some people, when rock and roll, the Beatles or the Stones or heavy metal or whatever, they probably read a whole lot of political content into that might not have been appropriate. But the musical form kind of has a potentiality of its own, and people will take it and do with it what they will. And I don't know how you could just sort of rule it out a priori that this musical form couldn't indeed be inspiring and progressive in that way.
That is a very important point, and it bears mentioning that I have read about rap, kind of an equivalent of gangster rap or more conscious political rap, happening in other countries and having some effect on people, where I think, okay, that's good, because the thing is, rap fundamentally is about confrontation. Whatever you're going to confront, the general idea is that everything has to be kind of spiky. There has to be a middle finger stuck up in the air, or at least a confrontational cadence. And so the idea is, what are you going to confront? If you are in the favelas, the slums in Brazil, and then somebody is going to have a confrontational cadence about how the government just doesn't seem to care, I'm all for that. That makes perfect sense to me. But when you are looking at children learning how to read by using phonics instead of whole word, and you're seeing charter schools working miracles with educating poor brown kids, and you're seeing all sorts of things that can be done to make a school good, when somebody sticks their middle finger up in the air and complains that there just aren't enough funds for the schools, I figure here in America, maybe that upturned middle finger isn't as important as it would have been 40 years ago. If there happened to be rap in Birmingham in 1963, I would have understood that.
So now, it's beginning to sound to me like your complaint is really not about music at all, but it's about political culture, which can adapt to any given musical form in any particularly helpful or unhelpful way. It's starting to sound like you wish that the underlying program of people who were in opposition and in kind of conflict was one more to your liking, and if so, then furthering it with a rhythm that gets people up out of their seats and gets them moving, and with a rhyme would be quite all right with you.
Yeah, except I think some things just don't happen to have a beat, and I think that a lot of the things that are helping not only black people but the poor, not just poor black people, aren't the sorts of things that lend themselves to this kind of iconography. And what makes me dedicate a book to this whole issue is that music and rhythm are so seductive, and I sound like I'm some sort of Puritan out of the Crucible or something, as if I don't like music and rhythm too. But they're so important. And all it takes, like for example, in Obama's speech about fatherhood recently, and I'm not trying to do this as a sort of a studied transition, but it really did come into my mind.
Well, let's move on to that, but I actually have one more thing I want to say, but go ahead.
Okay, when he says, any fool can make a child, you can read transcripts of the speech where any fool can make a child sounds almost dismissive. Watch him, listen to him as he says it, and he has a certain cadence, a certain melody and pacing that elicits the applause of the black audience. All it takes is saying something in a kind of a way, and hip-hop says things in such a seductive way that I worry about the distraction.
Okay, so do you talk about Christian hip-hop in your book?
I do not, because that's a whole different thing.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, and this was my point about how the content and the medium are not exactly the same thing. The message and the medium in this case, I think, are not. I mean, I can recall back when I was, more active in church and paying attention to what church people said more than I do these days. I can recall one of the pastors making a very persuasive case that the message, the Christian message, the message of the gospel, evangelizing, needed to be open enough to the various ebb and flow and flux of cultural form that it could, appropriate whatever the medium might be, and that the Christian message transcended that, and that if, to get kids to listen, you needed to put it in a rhyme and a beat. Well, there wasn't anything wrong with that. If it worked, it worked. If it didn't, it didn't. And that,
I'd be interested in seeing.
I don't know. I don't know if that cuts against the grain of your argument or not. But there certainly are people out there who have programs that I think you would credit. That are focused on responsibility and building capacity within communities, and sort of getting people to straighten up and clean up their lives, but who nevertheless find themselves repairing to hip hop as a way of reaching these kids.
And I really might lack imagination, and I would be interested to check up on this as time goes by. But I would imagine that the whole iconography, the whole cadence, the whole trope, to use an Ivy League word, of hip-hop would be best useful in the church if you were trying to sort of nudge people into doing something that they don't usually do by kind of slapping them on the wrists. And so maybe you could talk about being responsible for your kids or not having a gossipy tongue or something like that. I imagine that certainly might work because there has to be the confrontation. If there isn't that confrontational cadence as part of it, my sense is that for many people that would be kind of antique rap. It would be the kind of rap from the early 80s where people still usually rapped with smiles on their faces and the background was kind of tinkly. And those days seem to be gone. I don't know if Grandmaster Flash's early stuff would reach the modern teenager who wasn't even alive when that stuff was recorded. Maybe I'm wrong, though. I mean, that is food for thought.
Yeah, and also I think within the Christian thing, there certainly can be conflict, right? I mean, you could be fighting, the devil or whatever, and you can set up your oppositions rather naturally there. There's good and evil, there's light and darkness, all that.
That's right.
But be that as it may, so your book and your concerns about rap dovetail, do they, with the concerns that candidate Barack Obama was addressing himself to in this big, huge 20,000 member Pentecostal or apostolic congregation that he addressed on Father's Day?
How did you like it?
Okay, so two things. First.
Oh, now I know what you're going to say.
Oh well,
okay,
I'm not sure you do. Okay. First, I hated it.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
When I first heard about the idea of the speech and I saw a few of the clips, I hated it. Mm-hmm. Then, and I read a couple of the reports in the newspaper. Then, of course, I went to the YouTube or whatever, and I watched the speech. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I told my wife, and she's been teasing me ever since. I came away from that speech absolutely stunned by the
delivery.
by the abilities, the talents as a public communicator of this guy, Barack Obama. I thought the speech was just superbly, exquisitely rendered.
And he didn't grow up talking that way. I think it's amazing. It is absolutely. I'm so jealous.
That's a separate point. Okay, I grant you that too. But Barack Obama is an estimable character here. He's a man to be reckoned with, as we know. But I thought the way he delivered that speech, the way he played the audience, I thought the lines, some of the rhetorical devices that were used in it. It was in large part a reprise of a point that George W. Bush brought to our attention about the soft bigotry of low expectations in the 2000 campaign. It was, of course, much, much more than that. But it was, what are you celebrating about an 8th grade graduation and so forth and so on. I thought it was a call to higher ground that resonated. And when I took a kind of inventory in my mind of what I thought he might have been trying to accomplish with that speech, which was, he's back in a black church again, Yeah. And it's a different kind of church than the Reverend Jeremiah Wright's church. And of course, he's got to go back to church. He can't not go to church. So he's got to go into a church. It's Father's Day. He needs to get the values thing out there. He needs to get some of his biography out there, which was rolled into this. And he also perhaps, and this is maybe what ticked me off a bit, needs his sister soldier moment. That is to say, he needs to create an appeal to the voter out there who might have some doubts about what side he's on in these culture wars and these conflicts in the society that that are so potentially important politically. And he needed to signal that he was on their side, their being the majority, mainstream, whatever. And what better way of doing that than to quote courageously, and that's in quotes for me, denounce the lack of responsibility amongst African American males. So I thought he accomplished those things, but I was disturbed, and I am a little troubled by the converting into an entirely cultural issue that requires the responsibility of people to step up. Matters that I think are really not only or even not mainly cultural issues, and in a kind of we got these two different kinds of discourse going on: a political conversation about public life, government, law, policy, and our mutual responsibilities to one another as citizens. And then a communal conversation about norms, what it means to live up to the ideals of our forefathers, this kind of thing. Those things are not entirely separate, of course, they never have been, but I was a little bit disturbed by the way they were kind of neatly and opportunistically blended together by Barack Obama in that speech.
Glenn, you sound like... This sounds like Earl O'Farry Hutchinson, who has a piece.
Earl Hutchinson, a blogger, a guy that writes sometimes in the LA Times. Is that the guy?
Yeah.
I didn't know what he said. What did he say? I want to sound like me. I don't want to sound like anybody else.
No, frankly, with all due respect to him, I think you said it in a more interesting way, but he feels that Obama is beating up on black fathers or non-fathers when, in fact, he doesn't see a significant racial dimension to the problem. And I don't know, some of the terminology that you're using is interesting. For me, I always go back 100 years. Just go back 100 years, imagine it, keep it in color, make it feel like you're really there, except it's 100 years ago. What you say, the values thing. What's that? If you were talking to people 100 years ago, the notion that certain kinds of values were something which you may or may not consider important to bring up and talk about in clear language would have seemed kind of bizarre. There were a lot of hideous things about 100 years ago. But I mean in any community, white or black. It's funny that now we might talk about it as the values thing.
But, are you saying something other than that in the Victorian era, we were in the Victorian era and we don't live there anymore?
No, 100 years ago was almost random. Let's go back 60 years.
Okay. So that's not what you're saying. Okay.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. No, I didn't mean the Victorians. And it seems to me that there is a dimension of this that we need to think about, which is that there are countless black communities where, quite simply, it is the unusual thing to be raised by two parents. And so we can talk about statistics. Earl O'Farry Hutchinson has it from somewhere that it's fewer than half of black kids that live in single-parent households. Then you've got the other statistic, which is that as of about 10 years ago, 75% of black children were born out of wedlock. How you square those two, I don't know. But obviously there's the black inner city where it's unusual to have a father. Anybody who has any concern with the black community knows something which I always feel guilty about and a little sad about. You're walking around downtown and you see a baby in a stroller, and there's a woman behind it who is the baby's mother, and then there's also a guy behind it, and you can kind of look at the way the guy and the woman interact, and you can tell that he's the father, and through various indicators such as perhaps speech and clothing and demeanor, etc., you can tell that these are people who probably did not go to college and could be from what you might call the hood. And you see them, and it's unusual. You think to yourself, oh, it's a couple raising the child. And this is not a moralistic point. It's just to say that that is the way that it's been for the past 30 or 35 years. And I think that to look at that and say that, say, numerically, there are more white children who are born out of wedlock and raised by single mothers, well, of course, there are more white people. And to say that it isn't a problem that black people need to think of as a racial issue when it's such a large issue, and inner cities are so common to have almost only black people or brown people in them, and we all know that there's a larger poverty rate among black people in general. To say that it's just a matter of poverty seems to me to be a little bit, I don't want to say heartless, because I know that you care, but it just seems a little forced.
Hold on, John. I mean, I'm with you. You preach it to the choir on this. I agree with you that it's a problem, that it's a massive phenomenon sociologically, that it's a problem, that a lot of nonsense has been said about it being not a problem for a long time, going back 35, 40 years. Moynihan's name, the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, has come up, the Moynihan Report of 1965, when he was working for Lyndon Johnson in the White House, the report that called attention to, at that time, 1/4 of African-American children being born out of wedlock, and which concluded that this phenomenon would be a major impediment to achieving the goals of the civil rights movement. And I might add, a report that recommended putting on an extra shift at the post office and increasing public employment of unemployed black men as one remedy for that problem. But that's come up, and when it came out, it was castigated by people. So I'm with you 100%.
Everybody said that, well, this is a pattern from slavery.
Right. They said it was an inheritance from history. They said that you were blaming the victim by calling attention to it, and so forth and so on. So that's all fine. But the question I have is, that's all fine, and therefore, leaders in the community, communal leaders of African American peoples, like the heads of large congregations and so forth, need to find ways of addressing this problem and motivating their people to come, to grips with it and so forth and so on. The question is about politics, policy, public policy, and about pluralism, a society that has many different kinds of people in it, and about the appropriateness, the propriety of public leaders who would be leaders of the state, tax authority, making war and peace, the powers of the police, and so forth and so on. Leaders of the public enterprise who would single out a community and use a public forum. Now, the forum, of course, in question was a church, but we're in the middle of a political campaign. Nothing Barack Obama does or says, no move that he makes, no action he takes, can be understood outside the context of the imperatives of November. So the question is about that, in my mind. The question is, in other words, not about the need for there to be sermons, but about the appropriateness of presidential candidates delivering them to ethnic groups, especially when you consider that perhaps the motivation for delivering the sermon has at least as much to do with influencing people who are not members of that ethnic group, inducing them to say, oh, how courageous. What a visionary leader. This is exactly what we need. I've been wishing somebody would tell black people that forever. Why didn't Jesse Jackson ever say it? Oh, he did. Oh, but anyway, like that.
We're back to where we often go.
Which is?
Which is that you seem to often be so worried about the barstool white person, or the less than enlightened or charitable white person, and what they might think when a quote-unquote black conservative says something, or Bill Cosby. I hear you, Glenn. I hear
but that's
you
not all I'm saying. If I may interrupt just for a minute to clarify. It's not just that I'm worried that there's a reactionary out there who will be given aid and comfort by the fact that a black presidential candidate chastises black men for not doing well.
Yeah.
It's that the fundamental public question in my mind is, what are our obligations to each other here in this country? And I'm not just talking about taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor. I'm saying we're all in this together, kind of thing, and that the public responsibilities get short shrift when you frame the question as Senator Obama did in that church in Chicago on Sunday, and that
I hear you, yeah.
and that's the thing. I mean, I've listened very carefully to the policy prescriptions in that speech, because to my mind, that's all that counted. In other words, black people have been getting sermons and can get sermons ad infinitum. But what matters is, when you get your hands on the instruments of power in the government, what are you going to do?
Well, Glenn, here's the question. Maybe I might be naive. Maybe I don't see the world properly. I don't always. But the reflexive suspicion that so many in the punditocracy seem to have about what everyone is doing, and the motives that we seem so ready to impute, so many people seem to think that what Barack Obama did was a stratagem, a strategy. Suppose that's really what he is. Suppose that's really what he wanted to say to that group. And as far as him saying it to a black group when he's running for president, the fact is that, as we've talked about in the previous blogging heads, he's black now. The cat's out of the bag. And if he didn't give any sermons or speeches directly to the black community, that would elicit a whole raft of other sorts of questions. Suppose these prescriptions that he's talking about, suppose his notions of looking inward are really just what the man thought. And there's evidence that it is. For example, if you read his books, he comes up with things that you would call more centrist than necessarily leftist liberal. He has said things about how he would not want his children to have affirmative action, or how welfare reform in 1996 was not all a bad thing. That's who he is. And yet everybody watches him and thinks, oh, what's he trying to do? How's he trying to, get this segment of the electorate, etc., as if he isn't his own man.
Oh, okay. I mean, I'll just accept that without feeling I need to rebut it. I don't mean to impugn his sincerity.
Okay.
Hey, John, we're back. And
so we are back after commercial break. And that could just be him, and I think that there's all indication that those are his real feelings.
Okay, let's extend to him the benefit of the doubt about sincerity and say that he's not just posturing, he's saying what he really believes. Okay, I want to know how many instances can you think of in history where a group of people, a million strong, who have problems, whatever those problems might be. Maybe there's a culture of corruption that makes government institutions not function well. Maybe there's a kind of people get unemployed and they don't really look hard to try to find another job again, and so there's a kind of torpor, a kind of languishing in the culture, or whatever it might be. Maybe men have the habit of having multiple partners, and so the HIV virus has spread more than it otherwise should be. What instance can we point to where preaching to people, telling them be better? Come on, pull up your socks. Come on, let's live up to the high standards. Has turned a culture around that has a culture that has gone off the rails. I really have my doubts about it. I wonder whether or not temperance has been off and on a movement in American politics going back 200 years. Demon rum. Too many people are drunk. Too much alcohol. We had a whole, prohibition era. We have organizations that came into existence for the sole purpose of preaching abstinence from alcohol to people. Last time I checked, alcohol consumption was still pretty high. We've been fighting a war on drugs forever. Just say no. And the sentiment is perfectly respectable. It's not something that I'm going to ridicule or make fun of. I'm asking about the effectiveness of preaching to people to be better. So, over and above the rhetoric, and let the rhetoric be sincere, let me stipulate that, there is the question of whether or not, beyond political image making, there's something productive to be associated with, oh, finally somebody is saying it. I wish that people had said it long ago. A white politician couldn't have said it, and now we have someone who can, a breath of fresh air. I'm made a little unsettled by all of that, and don't trust it that it's going to get us to a solution.
I hear you. So.
Okay, I want to keep talking about the speech.
Good.
Because like I said, for my money, the hortatory, come on, you all be good, was less important than the bread and butter policies that were given short shrift at the end of the speech. I'm looking at the speech now, and I see some of these policies. We should be making it easier for fathers who make responsible choices and harder for those who avoid them. We should get rid of the financial penalties we impose on married couples right now and start making sure that every dime of child support goes directly to helping children instead of some bureaucrat. We should reward fathers who pay that child support with job training and job opportunities and a larger earned income tax credit. And I just skip over. We should expand programs that register nurses to visit expectant and new mothers and help them learn how to care for themselves and the baby. I think that's a hodgepodge. I think some of the stuff that's in there is really interesting, and some of it I think is crap, frankly. So for instance, nurses visiting mothers who are indigent, mothers who have their babies at the public hospital, who are on welfare or near poverty, and helping them learn how to take care of their children. I think that's a very, very good idea. I've been advocating that for 20 years, and right. I'm not alone. And there's a lot of social science evidence out there to suggest that that could make a difference. Carefully controlled experiments have been run where there's random assignment of mothers to some get the home visitation and some don't. And I reviewed that literature some years ago, and it does show, I think, really very convincingly. It's, of course, expensive. You're paying for a nurse, that's $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year, whose job is to go around and spend hours and hours sitting with mothers and telling them how to breastfeed and what about the nutrition for their kids and if they don't want to get pregnant again, what they need to do and so forth and so on.
Right.
It's expensive. It's the kind of thing that's done in other countries. France, for example, I think of offhand.
Very ordinary.
And it's a good thing. It is conventional social welfare policy from a kind of liberal Democrat's point of view. It expands the state and so forth. It's nevertheless a good thing. He didn't cost it out, but that's a good thing. Earned income tax credit benefits and job and employment training benefits to the fathers who pay their child support, but not to the fathers who don't. I really need to be persuaded that that's a good idea. That indeed, for someone whose life is dysfunctional, a person who's in and out of jail, who dropped out of high school, who can't hold a job and is not making his child support payments, we're going to deny them employment training. For the people who've got their acts together, we're going to have the public fisc underwrite part of their child support responsibilities because that's what it means to give them earned income tax credit benefits if they pay their child support on time.
Right.
He goes on to say that we should make sure that every dollar of child support goes to the mothers and the children and not to some bureaucrat. And that's the worst kind of Reagan-esque rhetoric because what he's talking about is, in some jurisdictions, when the fathers pay child support, the public welfare agency reduces the welfare benefit to the mother by an amount that the child support is paid. So the child support goes to offset the taxpayer's costs of maintaining the family. Well, he characterizes that as money going to some bureaucrat. He characterizes offsetting public responsibility for caring for children by the dollars that fathers would contribute as money going to some bureaucrat. I mean, I would have thought the argument would have been affirmative, not negative. In other words, the argument is more money for the family.
Right.
The welfare money plus the father's child support.
Right. And it seems to me that what he was doing there was putting his point in terms that were designed to stir an audience. And there's, of course, a certain imprecision there because, of course, that does imply that there are important bureaucracies that should not... It does imply that money should not go to a government which, of course, to some extent would be in the position of administering these programs and therefore would need the money. But the overall intent of what he said seems to be quite clear, and that is to help black communities and to try to bring black families, especially poor black families, together. Are you really that aroused in a negative way by some of the more abstruse implications that could be taken from the things that he said?
I'm not sure I understood your question. I think you're asking me, shouldn't I be happy about the idea that he's trying to, strengthen black families and encourage people to be more responsible? Did I understand you?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, it's a little bit like we had this discussion about Bill Cosby some time ago, where, you thought his book with Alvin Toussaint, Come On People, was an important work in our political culture, important for the future of black people and so forth. And I thought I wouldn't be against it. I'm not against, going and asking people to do better and trying to give them a checklist of, practical suggestions about how they might live their lives better. But whether or not it was something of real deep importance, I had my doubts. So likewise here, I want to say, the encouragement, the identification of the family as a central site in society where things, if they don't go right, really create profound difficulties both for the individuals involved and for all of us. The identification of the family as such a site. And then the exhortation. All of us Americans, and we in the black community know this better than most, really ought to redouble our efforts to try to get this right, because so much is at stake. Who can be against that? I'm not against that. I just want to be very clear. But the politics of it, it seems to me, is more than just that. It's also about, as I've said, whose responsibility is it here? And that to the extent, not that it's entirely a zero-sum game, but there's a zero-sum element in it. To the extent that personal responsibility rises, collective responsibility is diminished. The sense that we're all somehow entailed in these problems, and that we therefore can't just sit back with arms folded across our chest. Now, of course, he would say, and I think his supporters rightly, that that's not all he said, and that there are lines in the speech where he acknowledges, government has a role, but. And so he says, this is a speech on Father's Day in a church about the but, not about the role of government. It's not like I'm unaware of that. That's why I'm running for President of the United States, he would say, and I guess I have to say, yes, I hear that, and I'm going to stand back and see what you do.
Well, let me ask you a question. All of this is understood, but everything that you're saying leaves me wondering what, if I may, Glenn Loury would do if he were put in the White House and he were facing these problems. You seem to be taking a rather modular approach to these things. You have very coherent objections to certain phenomena or lines of argumentation that you see. But let's take, for example, a guy. He is 20-something years old, and he lives in Brooklyn, and he is father to 4 kids by 3 women. There really was someone like this. I wrote about him in one of my
Well, there's more than one
books.
someone.
Yeah, but I'm taking him as an archetype, and he has these kids, and he just works odd jobs. He doesn't really work. He certainly does not work 40 hours a week. He's a nice guy, for whatever it's worth. He actually goes and sees the kids. He doesn't exactly father them, but he goes and plays with them, etc. Everybody in the neighborhood likes him. And I'm mentioning him because you read life stories of people like this, unfortunately, often when they get killed. And this was somebody who got killed. I'm not going to say his name to protect the privacy of his family. But he was just this guy. And reading the interviews in the neighborhood after he was killed, it was clear that this guy not working 40 hours a week or more when he had 4 children in the neighborhood was just considered kind of ordinary. He was not really a father to any of those kids. Let's face it, he was probably going to make more kids. Nicest guy you'd ever want to meet. I'm not saying that he was some sort of terrible human being, and that's just the point. That's the norm. Now, my question is, you're saying that it's distasteful to see someone preaching to the black community. And it sounds to me almost like you're saying that, and I guess it's the difference between preaching and having a conversation. If we're not going to preach it, are we allowed to talk about it, and then where's the line between getting something into the national conversation and then being accused of preaching? That's the first thing. Then there's the second thing. So we can't preach about it. And then, on the other hand, when we've got the earned income tax credit, jiggering the earned income tax credit in such a way that one incentivizes deadbeat dads to maybe reconsider, it seems that we don't want that either, according to what you're saying, because it's too punitive to the ones who are in less of a position to do anything about that than other deadbeat dads. And so, what would you do about that guy?
Okay.
What are we going to do?
Yeah, you're asking me what to do about an incorrigible, what to do about somebody whose behavior is problematic. And I don't have to have an answer to that question. I mean, it's not entirely clear. It's really,
I would suggest, don't we want to do something to give him the incentive? Doesn't there have to be some change in the current procedure?
Well, I don't want to get into too much backing and feeling about, what I really meant was, but let me just say this. What I was saying was that if you increase the earned income tax credit transfer payments to guys who make child support on time, you're really having the public treasury underwrite part of the person's fiscal family responsibilities.
Yes.
In the doing of that, and that was not at all made clear in the statement that he made in the speech. Of course, it was just a short statement, but I'm not sure. The claim is we're going to give incentives and disincentives. So we're going to reward fathers who pay their child support on time, and we're going to punish fathers who don't pay their child support on time. And the point I was making was that maybe some of the people who don't pay their child support on time are actually the people who need, because their lives are more generally disorderly, the very employment training or other such supports that the public might be in a position to make. And it's a little bit like when a guy gets out of prison, we decide he's not going to be eligible for a Pell Grant because he's broken the law. And we're still punishing him by denying the access to benefits that would otherwise be available to somebody. And, we say, who do we want to reward? The one who obeys the law or the one who breaks the law? And at that level, it seems pretty compelling. We want to reward the one who obeys the law. But by denying support for education and the acquisition of skills to people who are coming out of prison, we may make it more likely that they lapse back into a life of crime, and so it could end up being self-defeating. It was kind of at that level that I was trying to. But having now explained myself, let me just very briefly say what you asked me, what would I do? I heard no discussion of the interrelationship between the criminal justice system and incarceration. I'm giving one example. And family responsibilities. People, according to the theory that's implicit in that speech, are capable of being good or bad. Some behave well, others don't. It's really on them. And we need to configure the system in such a way that the ones who are behaving badly have an incentive to do the right thing. But as I'm sure you know, the situation on the ground is really much more complicated than that. I mean, when I read the descriptions that these ethnographers, like the guy at Columbia, Sudhir Venkatesh, writing about public housing project in Chicago and gang life there and so on in his recent book, Gang Leader for a Day. When I read his description of life on the ground in those communities, it doesn't come across to me as, well, there were good people or bad people. They had the choices that they in front of them, a menu. Some picked the right, some picked the wrong, and so forth. It comes across to me instead that people are caught in mechanisms and situations that have all kinds of. Now, some people behave here, all kinds of forces that are operating on them. Some people behave heroically. Some are stronger, some are weaker. Some succumb. Some are in despair. Some have mental health problems. Many of them are tremendously poorly educated and kind of alienated from the structures of opportunity in the society. Mm-hmm. And it's not as if they simply, by acts of will, could turn their lives into something else.
Monsters,
so to just be concrete and answer you, I'd be looking for ways to identify and facilitate, help those people, including even the men who are not meeting their family responsibilities, but who are in these situations where where so much conspires against them. I'd be looking for for ways of us promoting a more positive agenda, not just a punitive agenda vis-a-vis these people.